The winter of 1943 arrived in the French countryside like a curse, settling over the land with a weight that felt almost biblical. Snow fell thick and relentless over the convent of Sainte-Croix, a stone fortress of faith perched on a hillside near the Belgian border, where the wind howled through the valleys like the voices of the damned. Inside its cold walls, Sister Catherine Dubois knelt in the chapel, her breath forming clouds in the frozen air, her knees aching against the hard stone floor. She wasn't praying for herself. She hadn't prayed for herself in months. She was praying for the 9 souls hidden beneath the floorboards of the storage cellar, 3 Jewish children, 2 resistance fighters, and 4 refugees whose names she'd been told to forget the moment they arrived. The occupation had changed everything. What had once been a place of quiet contemplation and service to God had become something else entirely. A way station on an underground railroad that stretched across occupied Europe. A fragile link in a chain of mercy that could snap at any moment. Sister Catherine had never imagined this would be her life. She'd taken her vows at 19, expecting a life of prayer, gardening, and tending to the sick in the village. Instead, at 42, she found herself forging baptismal certificates, teaching Jewish children Catholic prayers they could recite if questioned, and lying to armed men who could kill her without consequence. Outside, the sound of boots crunching through snow shattered the silence like breaking glass. Sister Catherine's hands trembled as she rose from the pew, her rosary beads clicking together with the movement. Through the frosted window, she saw them clearly now. A convoy of German vehicles, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like knives, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. This was it. The moment they'd all feared. The moment they'd prepared for but hoped would never come. The Gestapo had finally come for them. Mother Superior Agnes appeared beside her, materializing from the shadows like a ghost. Her face was carved from stone, every line and wrinkle a testament to the burdens she carried. At 58, she'd led this convent through the First War, through the Spanish flu, through economic collapse and reconstruction. But nothing had prepared her for this. Nothing could prepare anyone for this. "Get to the cellar," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear Catherine could see in her eyes. "Make sure they stay silent. No matter what happens up here, no matter what you hear, they must not make a sound. Not a whisper. Not a breath loud enough to be heard. Do you understand me, Catherine?" Sister Catherine nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She hurried through the narrow corridors, her habit swishing against the cold stone floors, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The convent felt different in these moments before dawn, suspended between darkness and light, between safety and disaster. She descended the wooden stairs to the cellar, each step creaking under her weight, and found Sister Beatrice sitting with the hidden refugees in the dim light of a single candle. Sister Beatrice was only 23, younger than Catherine had been when she took her vows, and the fear on her face was raw and undisguised. She'd been at the convent for less than a year, had barely finished her novitiate when the war turned their peaceful sanctuary into something dangerous and desperate. Her hands shook as she held them clasped in prayer, and Catherine could see tears glistening on her cheeks. The refugees huddled together beneath thin blankets, their faces pale and drawn. There was Monsieur Dubois, no relation to Catherine despite the shared name. A resistance fighter with a bullet wound in his shoulder that had barely healed. Beside him sat Jacques Moreau, another resistant, younger and more frightened, his eyes darting constantly toward the stairs. The 4 other adults were a family, the Leroux family, who'd been caught trying to cross into Switzerland and had been passed from safe house to safe house until they'd ended up here. And then there were the children. Little Sarah Goldstein, only 9 years old, clutched a wooden doll to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks in silent rivers. Her parents had been taken 6 months ago. She'd been smuggled out of Paris, hidden in a vegetable cart, had spent weeks moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. Beside her sat David and Jacob Rosen, brothers aged 7 and 10, who'd watched their father shot in the street and their mother dragged away screaming. They'd stopped speaking weeks ago. They just sat together, holding hands, staring at nothing. "They're here," Catherine whispered, kneeling beside the children. Not a sound, not even breathing too loud. Can you do that for me? Can you be brave? Sarah nodded, her lower lip trembling. Catherine wiped the tears away with gentle fingers, her heart breaking at the terror in the child's eyes. Be brave, little one. God is watching over you. I promise you, God is watching. She didn't know if she believed it anymore. She wanted to. She prayed to. But how could God watch while children suffered like this? How could God allow such evil to flourish? These were questions she couldn't answer. Questions that kept her awake at night. Questions that made her faith feel like sand slipping through her fingers. Above them, the front door of the convent crashed open with a sound like a gunshot. Obersturmführer Heinrich Vogel stepped into the entrance hall, his black SS uniform stark against the whitewashed walls, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floor. At 26, he'd already seen more death than most men see in a lifetime. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, his eyes hollow and ringed with dark circles. He'd been on the Eastern Front for 2 years before being transferred west, had fought in Stalingrad, had watched friends freeze to death in trenches, had executed partisans in villages whose names he couldn't remember. The war had carved something essential out of him, had left him hollow and cold and efficient. Behind him, Feldwebel Otto Schneider and 4 other soldiers filed in, their weapons ready, their expressions hard. Schneider was older, 34, a career soldier who'd served in Poland and France and Russia. He was tired. They were all tired. Tired of the cold, tired of the fighting, tired of the endless brutality that had become their daily existence. But orders were orders, and they'd learned long ago not to question them. Mother Superior Agnes stood in the center of the hall, her hands folded calmly before her, her spine straight, her expression serene. She'd been preparing for this moment, had rehearsed in her mind what she would say, how she would act. She would not show fear. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Gentlemen," she said in flawless German, her accent betraying her education, "you've arrived early for morning prayers. We don't usually begin until after sunrise." Vogel's jaw tightened at her tone. He'd heard it before, that calm defiance of those who believed themselves protected by God, who thought their faith made them untouchable. It irritated him more than open hostility would have. At least hostility was honest. "We have reports," he said coldly, his voice clipped and precise, "that this convent is harboring enemies of the Reich, Jews, resistance members, deserters, people who should have been handed over to the proper authorities. We harbor only those who seek God's mercy," Agnes replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "This is a house of worship, not a military installation. We serve God, not governments. Your God won't protect you from the consequences of treason. My God is the only protection I need." Vogel felt a flash of anger, hot and sudden. He was cold, he was exhausted, he hadn't slept properly in 3 days, and he didn't have time for theological debates with stubborn old women. "Then you won't mind if we search the premises." "I cannot stop you," Agnes said, "but I ask that you respect this sacred space. These walls have stood for 300 years. They've survived wars and plagues and revolutions. They'll survive you as well." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Vogel gestured sharply to his men. "Search everything. Every room, every closet, every corner. If they're here, I want them found." The soldiers spread out through the convent like wolves, their boots echoing through the halls as they tore through rooms with systematic brutality. They overturned beds, ripping sheets and blankets onto the floor. They opened cabinets and wardrobes, throwing habits and linens aside. They smashed pottery looking for hidden compartments. They tapped walls listening for hollow spaces. They moved through the building like a storm, leaving destruction in their wake. Sister Catherine heard it all from the cellar, every crash and shout filtering down through the floorboards. Her hand was pressed over Sarah's mouth, feeling the child's rapid breathing against her palm, feeling her own heart racing in sync. Sister Beatrice had her arms around the Rosen brothers, holding them close, whispering prayers so quietly they were almost inaudible. The resistance fighters sat rigid and still, knowing that if they were found, They'd be executed immediately. The LaRue family held each other, the parents shielding their teenage daughter between them. Minutes felt like hours. The search grew more violent as Vogel's frustration mounted. Each empty room was another failure, another waste of time, another reminder that the intelligence they'd received might be wrong. But it couldn't be wrong. The informant had been reliable before. Someone in the village had seen people entering the convent who never left. Someone had heard whispers about forged documents. Someone had talked. Then Schneider called out from the kitchen, his voice sharp with discovery. "Herr Obersturmführer, here." Vogel strode into the kitchen, his hand automatically moving to the pistol at his hip. Schneider stood beside a trapdoor partially concealed beneath a worn rug, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Vogel felt a surge of vindication. He'd been right. They were here. "Open it," he ordered. Two soldiers yanked the trapdoor open, revealing the dark staircase leading down into the cellar. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else, something human. Fear. He could smell fear. Vogel descended first, his pistol drawn, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The beam of his flashlight swept across the space, illuminating sacks of potatoes, barrels of wine, shelves of preserved food. And there in the corner, huddled together like frightened animals caught in a trap, were the refugees. Sister Catherine stood in front of them, her arms spread wide as if she could shield them all with her body, as if her faith alone could turn bullets aside. Sister Beatrice stood beside her, trembling so violently her veil shook, but she stood nonetheless, her young face set with determination that looked almost comical in its earnestness. "Step aside," Vogel ordered, his voice flat and emotionless. "No," Catherine said quietly, firmly. Vogel's eyes narrowed. He was used to obedience. He was used to fear. He wasn't used to middle-aged nuns refusing his direct orders. "I said step aside, or I will move you myself." "Then you'll have to move me," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Because I won't do it willingly." For a moment they stared at each other across the dim cellar, the SS officer and the nun, two people from completely different worlds locked in a silent battle of wills. Vogel could see the fear in her eyes, but he could also see something else. Conviction. The absolute certainty that what she was doing was right, regardless of the consequences. It infuriated him. He grabbed Catherine by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh through the fabric of her habit, and dragged her forcibly away from the group. She stumbled but didn't fall, catching herself against a support beam, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Take them," Vogel ordered his men, his voice harsh. "All of them. Load them into the trucks, now." The soldiers moved forward with practiced efficiency, hauling the refugees to their feet. Sarah screamed, a high piercing sound that cut through the air like a knife, clutching desperately at Sister Beatrice's habit. One of the resistance fighters, Monsieur Dubois, tried to resist and was immediately struck across the face with a rifle butt. Blood splattered across the stone floor, dark and wet. He crumpled, dazed, and was dragged toward the stairs. Catherine watched in horror as they were pulled away one by one. The LaRue family clung to each other, the mother sobbing, the father trying to maintain dignity even as his hands were bound. The Rosen brothers were silent, their faces blank, already retreating into whatever dark place they went to survive. Sarah fought like a wild animal, kicking and biting until a soldier simply picked her up and carried her, still screaming. Catherine's mind raced desperately. There had to be something she could do, some way to stop this, some words she could say, but what? What could she possibly say to change the mind of a man who'd been trained to see these people as less than human? Then she saw it. A detail so small she almost missed it. The way Vogel's hand shook as he holstered his pistol. The way his breath came in short, shallow gasps. The way his face had gone pale beneath the cold sweat that beaded on his forehead. The slight tremor in his jaw. He wasn't just cold. He was trembling, shaking. His body was betraying him, showing weakness he couldn't control. The refugees were being loaded into the trucks outside, their cries muffled by the falling snow. When Catherine made her decision, it was insane. It was probably suicidal, but she had to try. She climbed the stairs and walked directly across the entrance hall to where Vogel stood, barking orders to his men, his voice sharp and authoritative, even as his hands continued to shake. "Obersturmführer," she said calmly, as if they were meeting at a social function. He turned to her, irritation flashing in his hollow eyes. "What do you want, sister? Haven't you caused enough trouble?" She gestured to a wooden chair beside the fireplace, where embers still glowed faintly. "Sit down." Vogel blinked, completely caught off guard. "What?" "Sit down," she repeated, her voice steady and firm, the same tone she'd used with wounded soldiers during the First War, the voice of a nurse who expected to be obeyed. "You're shaking." For a moment, Vogel just stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. No one spoke to him like that. No one. He was an officer of the SS, a representative of the most feared organization in Europe, a man with the power of life and death. People cowered before him. They begged. They wept. They offered bribes. They didn't tell him to sit down like he was a sick patient. But something in her tone, something in the calm, almost maternal authority of it, cut through his defenses like a hot knife through butter. He looked down at his hands and saw that she was right. They were trembling uncontrollably, shaking so badly he couldn't have held his pistol steady if he'd needed to. "I don't need to sit," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, sounded weak even to his own ears. "You do," Catherine said matter-of-factly. She moved to the fireplace and added another log, stirring the embers until flames licked up around the new wood. "You're exhausted. You haven't slept properly in days, maybe weeks. You're cold, you're hungry, and you're pushing yourself beyond what your body can endure. If you don't sit down soon, you're going to collapse." Vogel's jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about me." "I know what I see," Catherine said, filling a tin cup with hot water from the kettle hanging over the fire. She added a pinch of herbs from a jar on the mantel, something that would help with the trembling, help calm his nerves. "And I see a man who's forgotten how to take care of himself, a man who's so focused on his duty that he's destroying himself in the process." Vogel stared at the cup in her hand. Steam rose from it, curling in the cold air. He should refuse it. He should order her to be silent. He should have her arrested for insubordination, for interfering with official business. But instead, almost against his will, he reached out and took the cup. The warmth of it against his frozen fingers felt like a small miracle, like the first hint of spring after an endless winter. He sat down. Catherine pulled another chair close and sat across from him, her movements calm and deliberate. Outside, the soldiers were still loading the refugees into the trucks. She could hear Sarah still crying, could hear the soldiers shouting orders. Schneider appeared in the doorway, looking utterly confused by the scene before him, his Obersturmführer sitting by a fire drinking tea with a nun. "Herr Obersturmführer, should we—" "Wait," Vogel said quietly, not looking up from the cup. "Just wait." Schneider hesitated, glanced at Catherine, then nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." He stepped back outside, pulling the door partially closed behind him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Vogel sipped the hot water, feeling it warm his insides, feeling the herbs begin to work on his frayed nerves. He hadn't realized how cold he'd been until now, how tired, how utterly drained. It had been 3 days since he'd slept more than an hour, 2 weeks since he'd had a proper meal, months since he'd felt anything resembling comfort. The cup shook in his hands despite the warmth. "Why did you hide them?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because they needed help," Catherine said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "They're enemies of the Reich. They're human beings. That's not how the world works." "Maybe not your world," Catherine said gently, "but it's how mine works. It's how it should work." Vogel looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't young. There were lines around her eyes, gray in her hair beneath her veil. Her hands were rough and calloused from work, but there was something in her expression that he hadn't seen in a long time, something he'd almost forgotten existed in the world. Compassion. Genuine, uncomplicated compassion. "You know I have to take them," he said quietly. "I know. You know what will happen to them. I know. Then why do you look at me like that? Like what? Like I'm still human. Like I'm still worth saving." Catherine tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Aren't you?" The question hit him like a physical blow, like a punch to the gut that knocked the air from his lungs. Vogel set the cup down carefully, his hands still shaking. He thought of all the things he'd done in the name of duty. The villages he'd burned in Russia, the smoke rising into gray skies. The people he'd executed, lined up against walls, their pleas falling on deaf ears. The orders he'd followed without question, without hesitation, because questioning meant weakness and weakness meant death. He'd told himself it was necessary, that it was war, that he was just a soldier doing his job, following orders, serving his country. He'd told himself that the people he killed were enemies, were threats, were less than human. He'd built walls around his conscience brick by brick, until he couldn't feel anything anymore. But sitting here in this quiet convent with this nun who looked at him not with fear or hatred, but with something that felt almost like pity, he couldn't escape the truth. He'd become a monster. Somewhere along the way, in the blood and the screaming and the endless brutality, he'd lost himself completely. "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't have any choice anymore." "There's always a choice," Catherine said softly. "Not for me. Not anymore. If I disobey orders, they'll execute me. If I show mercy, they'll call it weakness. If I hesitate, they'll replace me with someone worse. There's no choice. There's only survival." "Then I'm sorry for you." Vogel stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Don't pity me," he said harshly, anger flaring hot in his chest. "I don't need your pity. I don't want it." "I'm not pitying you," Catherine said, rising slowly to face him. "I'm mourning you. Because the man you could have been is dying inside the man you've become, and that's a tragedy." Vogel's hand moved instinctively to his pistol, but he didn't draw it. He just stood there, breathing hard, his eyes locked on hers. Outside, one of the children was crying. He could hear Sarah's small voice calling desperately for Sister Catherine, calling for someone to save her. "I have my orders," he said. "I know. I can't disobey them. I know." "Then why are you doing this? Why are you making this harder? Why can't you just hate me like everyone else?" "Because someone needs to remind you that you're still human," Catherine said. "Even if you've forgotten. Even if you don't want to remember. Someone needs to see you as more than the uniform you wear." Vogel turned away from her, his shoulders tense, his whole body rigid with conflict. He walked to the door and stood there for a long moment, staring out at the trucks, at the refugees huddled in the cold, at his men waiting impatiently for his command. The snow was still falling, covering everything in white, making the world look clean and pure even though it was anything but. He thought of his mother, back in Berlin. She'd been a nurse in the First War. She'd taught him to help people, to see the humanity in everyone. What would she think of him now? What would she say if she could see what he'd become? He thought of his younger brother, killed at Stalingrad. His brother who'd written letters about the horror of the Eastern Front, about the things they were being ordered to do, about how he didn't recognize himself anymore. His brother who'd died in the snow, frozen and alone, probably calling for their mother. He thought of the man he'd been before the war, the university student who'd wanted to be a teacher, the young man who'd believed in honor and duty and serving something greater than himself. That man felt like a stranger now, like someone from another lifetime. Then he spoke, his voice low and strained, each word feeling like it was being dragged out of him against his will. "Schneider." The sergeant appeared immediately, snapping to attention. Yes, Herr Obersturmführer? How many did we find? Schneider frowned slightly, confused by the question. 9, sir. 2 men, 4 adults from the family, and 3 children. How many does the paperwork say we were looking for? Schneider pulled out a folded document from his coat pocket, scanning it quickly. The report said approximately 6 to 8 individuals, sir. Suspected resistance members and possible Jewish refugees. Vogel nodded slowly, his jaw tight. Then we found 8. The adult men and women, the resistance fighters and the family, load them into the trucks. And the children, sir? The question hung in the cold air. Vogel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. There were no children. Schneider's eyes widened slightly. Sir, there are 3. There were no children, Feldwebel, Vogel repeated, his voice hard as iron, leaving no room for argument. Do you understand me? We found 8 adults. No children. The intelligence was incorrect about the numbers. A long pause. Schneider looked at his commanding officer, really looked at him, and saw something in Vogel's face that made him understand. A crack in the armor. A moment of humanity breaking through. He'd served with Vogel for 8 months. He'd watched him become harder, colder, more ruthless. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something human left inside. Yes, sir, Schneider said quietly. No children. The intelligence was incorrect. The nuns will be reprimanded for providing aid to enemies of the Reich. We'll confiscate their winter food stores as punishment. They'll learn that there are consequences for harboring criminals. But the search is over. We're leaving in 5 minutes. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She watched as Schneider relayed the orders to the other soldiers, watched their confusion, watched some of them glance back at the convent with questions in their eyes. But orders were orders, and they obeyed. They pulled the adult refugees from where they'd been herded, loading them into the trucks with rough efficiency. But they left the cellar without searching it again. They left the children huddled in the corner where they'd been found, hidden in shadows. The soldiers began loading sacks of grain and barrels of preserved food from the convent stores, their punishment for harboring enemies. It would make the winter harder for the nuns. They'd go hungry, but they'd survive. And so would the children. Mother Superior Agnes watched from the doorway, her face unreadable. She caught Catherine's eye and gave the smallest of nods. She understood what had happened, what Vogel had chosen to do. Vogel supervised the confiscation with cold efficiency, his face expressionless, his voice sharp as he directed his men. He never looked at Catherine again. Didn't dare. If he looked at her, he might change his mind. He might remember that he was still capable of mercy, and that was dangerous. That could get him killed. Within 20 minutes, the convoy was loaded and ready to leave. The 8 adult refugees sat in the back of the trucks, their faces resigned, knowing what awaited them. Monsieur Dubois, the resistance fighter, caught Catherine's eye through the canvas covering and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. For the children, for saving at least some of them. Vogel climbed into the lead vehicle, his movement stiff and mechanical. He didn't look back at the convent, didn't allow himself to. As the trucks pulled away, their engines rumbling, their tracks cutting through the fresh snow, Catherine stood in the doorway watching them disappear into the gray morning. Her legs felt weak. Her hands were still shaking. She'd been certain she was going to die. Certain they all were. But somehow, impossibly, 3 children were still alive, still safe, still hidden in the cellar below. Mother Superior Agnes appeared beside her, her hand resting gently on Catherine's shoulder. What happened in there? I don't know, Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. I think I reminded him of something he'd lost, something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Will he come back? I don't know, maybe. Maybe when he realizes what he's done, he'll regret it. Maybe they'll punish him for showing mercy. Then we'll pray for him. Yes, Catherine said. We'll pray for him. But Vogel didn't come back. The convoy never returned to Sainte Croix. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The three children, Sarah Goldstein and the Rosen brothers David and Jacob, remained hidden in the convent, moving between the cellar and a hidden room behind the chapel. Sister Catherine taught them their Catholic prayers, gave them new names, created false documents that would protect them if questioned. She became their mother in all but blood, protecting them, nurturing them, helping them survive in a world that wanted them dead. The winter was brutal. Without their food stores, the nuns went hungry. They survived on thin soup and stale bread, rationing everything, going to bed with empty stomachs. But they survived. And more importantly, the children survived. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the snow melting to reveal a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally different. The war continued. More refugees came through, staying for days or weeks before moving on to the next safe house. Sister Catherine continued her work, forging documents, hiding people, risking her life every single day for strangers she'd never met. She never saw Obersturmführer Heinrich Vogel again. But sometimes, late at night when she knelt in the chapel and prayed, she included him in her prayers, prayed that somewhere in the darkness and chaos of the war he'd found a way back to the man he'd once been, prayed that the small act of mercy he'd shown that frozen morning had been the first step toward redemption, prayed that when he finally faced judgment, whether from man or God, that moment of compassion would be remembered. She never knew if her prayers were answered. After the war, when the records were finally opened and the histories were written, it showed that Obersturmführer Heinrich Vogel was killed in action during the Battle of Berlin in April 1945. No details were recorded about his final moments. No one knew if he died fighting for a cause he'd stopped believing in, or if he'd finally found the courage to choose a different path. The records simply listed him as killed in action, another name on an endless list of the dead. But in the village near Sainte Croix, the story was told for generations. The story of the nun who looked an SS officer in the eye and told him to sit down. The story of the moment when compassion confronted cruelty, and for just a few minutes, won. The story became legend, embellished and changed over the years, but the core remained the same. A reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could still shine through. Sister Catherine Dubois lived until 1982, passing away peacefully at the age of 81. She never spoke much about the war years, never sought recognition or medals. She simply continued her work, caring for the sick, teaching children, serving her community. She lived quietly, humbly, the way she'd always intended. At her funeral, 3 elderly people stood together at the back of the church, Sarah, David, and Jacob, the children she'd saved that frozen morning so many decades ago. They'd come from 3 different countries to pay their respects to the woman who'd given them their lives. Sarah had become a doctor in Israel. David was a professor in America. Jacob owned a bakery in Paris. They'd all built lives, had families, had children and grandchildren who would never have existed if not for Sister Catherine's courage. And though the world had moved on, though the war had become history and the horrors had faded into memory and textbooks, they never forgot the lessons she'd taught them. That even in the darkest times, even when facing the worst humanity has to offer, a single act of compassion can change everything. That the smallest gesture of kindness can crack open the hardest heart. That sometimes, the most powerful weapon against evil isn't violence or anger or hatred. It's simply seeing the humanity in another person, even when they've forgotten it themselves. The story of Sister Catherine and Obersturmführer Vogel became one of thousands of small, quiet moments of resistance that happened during World War II. Moments that didn't change the course of the war. Moments that didn't make headlines or win medals or get recorded in official histories. But moments that mattered nonetheless, because they reminded people that even in hell, heaven still exists. Even in darkness there's light. And even when all seems lost, when evil seems overwhelming and unstoppable, there's still hope. There's still choice. There's still the possibility of redemption, even for those who seem beyond saving. The war ended. Europe rebuilt. The survivors told their stories. And in a small convent on a hillside near the Belgian border, nuns continued their work, praying and serving and remembering. remembering that faith isn't just about believing in God. It's about believing in people, about seeing the divine spark in every human being no matter how deeply buried it might be. Sister Catherine's grave is simple, marked only with her name and dates. But every year, on the anniversary of that frozen morning in 1943, someone leaves flowers there. Sometimes it's one of the survivors. Sometimes it's their children or grandchildren. Sometimes it's someone from the village who heard the story and wanted to honor her memory. And if you visit the convent of Sainte Croix today, now a museum and memorial, you can see the cellar where the children hid. You can see the chair by the fireplace where an SS officer sat and drank tea with a nun. You can see the records Sister Catherine forged, the false documents that saved lives. You can read the testimonies of the survivors, their words preserved for future generations. But more than that, you can feel something there, something that transcends history and memory, a reminder that in our darkest moments we still have choices, that compassion is never wasted, that seeing the humanity in others, even our enemies, is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. If you found this story moving, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a like if this touched your heart, and share in the comments what acts of kindness have changed your life. History isn't just about the big battles and famous names. It's about moments like these, moments that remind us what it means to be human, moments that show us that even when the world seems consumed by darkness, there are still people willing to light a candle. And sometimes, that's enough.